All right, so in this video, we are going to look at data ingestion using the Polars library. So I have got a blank Jupyter notebook in this demo directory where I also have that Netflix title CSV and store sales forecasting CSV. And I showed you where I downloaded those from in the first video of this playlist. So I am going to import both pandas as PD and then import polars as PL. All right, so when I was doing the pandas basics playlist, we did a data ingestion video, and I just focused on the store sales forecasting. And I specifically chose that data set because there are some encoding issues that make it not as straightforward as it usually is. So I am going to show you that here because it's interesting, the difference in how that's read with pandas versus polars. But I'm also going to show you the more mundane instance as well, which this is going to be 99.9% of the time it just works with that Netflix titles. All right, so if you recall, when we have pandas, right, so if we were looking for data ingestion, we were looking for methods that started with the word read. So we have like a read CSV method, a read Excel method, a read SPSS, SQL, Parquet, Pickle, a lot of different methods that are built into Polars to help you do that data ingestion. All right, so we're going to start off reading this Netflix titles. It's a CSV file, so what we can do is we can use pandas read CSV. I'm going to do a single quote, and I'm going to hit N and tab. And it says, hey, I found this Netflix titles.csv in that directory. All right, so I'm just going to say that this is going to be my Netflix data PD. All right, so that just works, right? So if I were to look at this, print that to the screen, we can see that it reads in, 8,807 rows. And we have an index and columns, which is going to be typical of a pandas data frame, which is in fact what we have if we look at the type of that. All right, so again, just kind of some key things with pandas, right? So pandas is going to have an index, so it's got these labels that it's created out here to the left, 0, 1, 2, and then you've got column labels. All right, let's do the same thing with polar. So if we do a PL dot, start RE and hit tab, you'll see that we've got a lot of read methods as well. We don't have as many as we had with pandas, and that could be an artifact again of, pandas has been around for a long time, and it supports a tremendous amount of, data formats that it can read. And it seems to be that polars is a little bit more selective. Maybe these are just, data formats that have, withstood the test of time, or in some cases it does just seem that it's being just a little bit more selective, like we don't see a read stata or a read SPS type of options. Now there might be some other options within polars that would allow us to get those files in, and I'm sure there's definitely a way to do that, but this is what we have available. But we do have a read CSV, so let's just do read CSV. I'm going to look at the call signature. We have a lot of different ways that we can customize that. But just like we saw with pandas, the first argument needs to be the source. So we can provide that file path. And then we do a PL read CSV, and we get that data in. Now there's a few differences. So first off, this looks maybe very, very similar to pandas. One thing I want you to note is that we don't have an index, right? So remember when we had that pandas data frame, I'll just print that again to show you. So there's that Netflix data PD, right? Out to the left, we've got that 0, 1, 2, and so forth. So, we have an index, and that allows us to essentially grab particular values by that index. And that's automatically created for us when pandas reads that data. We do not have that when we are looking at polars, right? So polars is based off of an arrow columnar format, right? So if I were to just look that up real quick, right? So we'll do Apache arrow columnar format. All right, so this is a specification for a format for data that is, organized in columns, and it does have some features here that are related to, like, computational efficiency and memory here. So This is a fairly recent specification. I believe probably at the time that Pandas was developed, right? I don't believe this specification would have existed, and it does, really kind of leverage some of the latest, research and best practices in infrastructure with modern hardware on computers. However, it's columnar. We don't have an index. Okay, so we can just save that as PL. All right, so the ingest is really the same, and if we look at the type of that, all right, so that is a polars data frame. So we see that there's a lot of consistency in pandas and polars with respect to how we're reading data. In fact, all we have to do is change it from pd.readcsv to PL. And there's going to be, I wouldn't say, the majority of cases where that's going to be true in polars, but there is going to be a tremendous amount of similarity. In this case, it's really kind of drop in. We just change it from PD to PL and it works. That won't always be the case, but there will definitely be a lot of similarities. If we do things a certain way in pandas, we'll have a similar type of syntax when we go to polars. So it is, they did recognize when they were creating polars that, at least in the Python ecosystem, pandas is a very well-known, widely used library, and they did try to at least help those users so it's not a completely different, learning a completely different set of syntax and terminology. All right, so let's do this store sales forecasting. So I'm going to do a pd.read CSV. And then we'll do stores sales forecasting. And this one will give us an error. So when we try to read this in with pandas, it gives us back a Unicode decode error, right? And it says, hey, well, UTF-8 cannot decode a particular byte. And what it turns out is that, one of the strings that are represented in this data set actually cannot be represented with UTF-8. That's basically what it's saying. So we see this sometimes when we might have, text that is, international. So they might have certain characters or certain accents that are not part of the UTF-8 kind of lexicon of, valid characters. And we saw that we could, fix that by saying, okay, well, we can provide actually another encoding. So pandas will allow us to say, hey, you can do an encoding, or you can tell it what to do with errors. So I'm just going to look up pandas read CSV. I think this will be a little bit of an easier way to do this. So if we go to pandas read CSV documentation, so we can see in here, there's a tremendous amount of parameters. We have this encoding and encoding errors. So I'm just going to scroll down and look at the documentation on those two. All right, so for encoding, right, we can specify an encoding to use. All right, notice by default it's going to assume UTF-8, and that's what's giving us the issue here. So apparently one of the characters can't be decoded with UTF-8, so that gives us an error. You can click here, and let's just see if we can open that link in a new tab. So it gives us a list of some other encodings that we might try. The one that we found that actually works is Latin 1. So we can do a Latin 1 encoding, and that should work. We'll give that a shot here in a minute. All right, and just another thing that you can give it encoding errors. You can say, hey, well, if you get an encoding error, do something with that. And the possible things that we can do is, by default, it's set to strict, where it's going to raise that Unicode error. You can just ignore it, right? Continue without further notice. So I think it would just skip the character. You can replace, right? So you can replace it with something like this. So it's a little question mark character, and you can do other things. So we'll look at both changing the encoding itself and then actually specifying errors to replace. So either one of those would work. So we could say, well, hey, I wanted to use a different encoding. We just looked up that we could use this Latin 1. Let's see if that works. All right, so that was fine. All right, so that gets around that error. Or we could say encoding errors is equal to replace. Either one of those is going to get it in. It's just wherever that character was in this data set that gave us some issues, it's going to replace that with that question mark. So I'm going to say this is going to be sales data BD. All right, and again, notice before I run this, right, so it's a pandas data frame, so we have both index labels and column labels. All right, now the interesting thing was when I did that PD read CSV without specifying the errors, so again, just to show you, when we did this, it gave me an error, right? So it said, hey, I've got this encoding issue, I can't figure out, you're going to have to give me either more information or just tell me to skip it. All right, let's look at what happens when we use polars. So I'm going to do a read CSV. All right, it works, right? So I don't get an error, but one thing that you should note is that the data doesn't look right. All right, so first off, it's reporting a shape, and it says, well, there's 0 rows and there's 42,441 columns. Right, and if I just kind of scroll to the end, it almost looks like some of the data has just been read in as column names. Right, so something has definitely happened in this, so it did not read it correctly, and I'm not sure exactly what the internals are that make it where that particular error is causing a problem where, you know, pandas is saying, hey, I don't know what's going on here, but polars is basically interpreting it as, well, everything's column names. But just to let you know that, you know, you can have different manifestations of issues as a result of this error. So again, in this case, you know, you should of course always test with your data. Just make sure things are coming in as you want. But in this case, we notice something looks wrong. And again, it doesn't really give you an error. So, you know, if you ever do get a situation where you're trying to read something with polars, and again, this is going to be a very, very, very small percentage. Actually, this is maybe the only data set that I've found that's done this, but I wanted to show this example because I think that's useful. So you could maybe test it with pandas and see if pandas, you know, how are they reading things differently? And then you might have to do a little bit of troubleshooting there, right? One thing about polars, if we go through and I'm going to look through their read CSV documentation, we also have an encoding structure there, or an encoding argument. We also have an ignore errors. Let's just take a look. I'm actually going to just pull up the documentation instead of, you know, trying to read it within that doc stream because there's so much there. So I'm going to say polars read CSV. All right, so we've got encoding, and in particular, I'm going to look at encoding, and I'm going to look at ignore errors. So when we have ignore errors, try to keep reading lines. If some lines yield errors before using this option, try to do. So looks like we didn't necessarily get an error, so it looks like that might not be, you know, all that applicable for us. And we can do encoding. And so interestingly, so we don't have that encoding errors, right? So we just have encoding. So by default, I believe this is going to be UTF-8, but notice that it has an option called UTF-8 lossy. So lossy means that invalid UTF-8 values are replaced with that special character. So it's they've kind of combined that encoding and encoding errors into one argument. And of course, it seems that you can specify other encodings, right? So let's just take a look at this and let's just see what happens. All right, so the first thing to note is if I were to say, well, give me my encoding and let's make this Latin 1, all right, it does in fact read as we would expect. And let's just say, what if we went to UTF-8 and what was there? Let's see. So it was UTF-8 hyphen lossy. All right, so let's do that as UTF-8 lossy. All right, so in this case, the UTF-8 lossy is not working correct. And I think, again, we would kind of see that because for some reason, polars is just not interpreting that byte as being incorrect. So again, you know, just a little bit of a caveat there. You might want to try, I mean, if you're reading in your data with polars and everything looks great, you know, you can by all means go ahead with that. Otherwise, you can, if you're getting weird errors like we're seeing here, you can of course try it with pandas, see if it's giving you an error, because it seemed in this case at least that pandas will give us a little bit more information or useful information on what was going on. But now we do that encoding Latin 1 and everything works. All right, so I know this is, we've seen two cases, the Netflix data where everything kind of came in as we would expect, which is again the typical case. I mean, I would say it's very rare for me to have to go in and specify encodings. I think, maybe at most one other time I've had to do that in the past. So this is very atypical, but I did want to show you that, both read CSV for polars and pandas, they have a lot of options. They're very rich functions. So you can go in and really kind of tweak things to kind of fit your situation. All right, I'm going to stop this video right here.